Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to our fellow UN Innovation Network colleagues. It's fantastic to see faces and places represented. My name's Tanya Accone. I'm the Senior Advisor on Innovation at Scale at UNICEF. And a little bit about why I'm sort of so interested and engaged in this particular topic, and was really delighted that Kat and I were invited to share some of our experiences, is that for the last 6 years, I've managed UNICEF's completely remote team. So we'll be asking you in a little while to tell us a bit about your teams. But in this case, this is a totally remote, in other words, there is no physical home or physical office, team that varies between sort of 12 to 18 people. It's a mix of staff and consultants, full and part-time, and it spans 11 locations, and depending how those locations move, from 7 to 11 time zones, and including a number of digital nomads. And we'll talk a little bit about what we've learned over the last 6 years, whether you're joining such a team, you're a team member, or you're trying to manage and lead this sort of team, because what we've learned from being more on the extreme of remote working absolutely applies as you get kind of closer and closer to a hybrid model. So let me turn it over to Kat to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you, Tanya, and thank you to everyone who's joining. Great to see you all introducing yourselves in the chat from so many different time zones and parts of the world. I'm Kat Crisp, working on the sort of field engagement and capacity building team with Tanya. I have sort of, as well as working over the past sort of what will be 3 years now on this team, I guess over the last 15 years have worked in some way, shape or form in different versions of kind of remote and hybrids and semi-hybrid teams. So it's a very, it's very interesting, and it's been fascinating to see everyone then suddenly kind of thrown into this situation over the last few months, although we wouldn't have wished that to be the case. But hopefully this is kind of creating a great opportunity to look at sort of new innovative tools and ways of working, and really looking forward to hearing from all of you on the chat as well about sort of your experiences and things that have worked and not worked. Thank you. And over.
Tanya, I think you're on mute.
That's weird. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. So to back up, throughout we're encouraging you to please share your questions, your experiences, your thoughts in the chat throughout, so that we can, turn to that through the session, and especially in the last kind of portion of it, so that we hear and learn as much from you and your experiences, and can also answer all sorts of questions that might come up throughout. And in a little while, we're going to have a little bit of interactivity. But I thought just to start with sort of some personal stories, because for a long time, our team has actually lived in these little boxes, whether they were Microsoft Teams or Zoom or Skype for Business, because the people in these photographs have a number of things in common. Number one, yes, they all obviously work for UNICEF's Office of Innovation. But number two, most of these people have worked together for 3 to 4 years. And these two photographs from two separate teams are actually, in many cases, the first time that any of these people had actually physically met. So in some cases, on the bottom left, at least half of the people in that photograph had been working for almost 4 years. And this was one sort of specific occasion where we were able to seize on an opportunity to actually get together and to bring people together physically. And I think that one of the learnings that we'll reflect upon later is that there are a lot of ways that working virtually, telecommuting, etc., has huge benefits. But at heart, we're human beings, we're social animals. And that social connection is probably one of the greatest challenges and opportunities to actually deal with in terms of working remotely. A couple of other interesting facts about the people in these photographs is that a lot of them have actually shifted from location to location. So I mentioned digital nomads. We've had people moving from Kampala to Nairobi to Paris to Kuala Lumpur. So I know we have at least one person here from Malaysia and has had to deal with probably what you do, which is living on the edge of the time zones. We've had other people who've sort of moved from Dakar to Geneva, to Vietnam. So it really is a whole mix of people working from different places, because those are the locations that both for what we need to achieve and often for what they need in their personal lives fits very well. But having shared a little bit about like putting faces to some of the experiences we'll be sharing over the next minutes, we wanted to poll all of you to find out a bit more about where you've been in this journey on teleworking, telecommuting, working from home, or in fact working from anywhere. So we'd like to ask you 3 short questions so we can find out a bit more about each other. Here's the first one. We'd love to know, did you telecommute or work remotely regularly before COVID-19? So we'll give it a few minutes, not minutes, a few moments, so we can get most of your votes in. Come on, who are the last 9 people? I think we can clearly see a pattern developing here. So even if the next sets of people voted differently, so definitely the kind of profile of most people on the call is that you didn't do this do this regularly. So to the next question, are you, so if we can just do the next question, do you expect to telecommute or work remotely regularly in the future? So you might be quite certain about whether this is a yes or a no, or you might not be sure at all, because this is a time of significant uncertainty, and some of our choices are certainly governed by the sorts of options and flexibility that our relative organizations provide. All right, so we can kind of see quite a big change. Just in comparison, the previous poll, 76% of you said you did not do so regularly, but here we can see that 60% of you actually expect to do so. And not surprisingly, almost 30%, almost a third of everyone is really not sure what the future holds in terms of, are you going to be remote? Will you be part of a hybrid team? So hopefully this session will be really helpful. And our last question is that we would really love to know how you would best describe your team. So is it more traditional office-based? Is it more of a flexible working team where, for example, it's quite usual for people to telecommute? Is it already a hybrid team where some people are in one location, others are remote? Or is it part of a team that is actually very much fully remote? So if I were answering this question, and I think Kat as well, we would put ourselves in that last basket, but we know very much that we have been outliers. So we've got just a few more people to add in. And I happen to know who that who that one person is in the fully remote team. That would be Eleanor Gutty from our team, who's on this call. Hi, Ellie. Great. So if we look at this, by and far, most people have come from traditional office-based teams. And so this entire kind of COVID-driven change to being remote teams has been not by choice, but by sort of situation and context. And it's also pretty interesting to see that 17% are already we're in a hybrid team. So we're looking forward to the first group sharing lots of your questions about things that you'd like to know and challenges that you sort of foresee, in case that we and others on this call can share some learnings and insights. And some of those learning insights will certainly come from some of the other groups here. Great, thanks Helen for popping the poll up. And if we can move on and take it off. Is it possible for you to remove the poll?
Should be gone now.
Probably just me. All right, so We're going to kind of do two views of this, starting with the big picture side of things, and remembering that the big picture is really our context and it has specific individual impacts. So per our last question, there's really a spectrum on which remote working can range from. So it can be completely remote, where no one actually has an office, there's no home office, there is no actual physical location to go through and to go to. And there was the office that we all knew and which is likely never to return. So that sort of de facto means we all need to continue to hone our skills and our strategies because all of us are either going to be in some kind of a hybrid team, but certainly what all of us can be sure about is it's not going to we're not going to be going back to anything. We are in fact moving towards our next normal. And let me just turn it over to Kat to share a little bit more about the COVID context and what we understand that it introduces to us.
Thanks, Tanya, and thank you everyone for your insights onto that poll. It's definitely suggesting we're going to see some quite significant shifts in how we work over the coming years. And I think, you know, as Tanya said a little while ago, the big difference between how we have set our team up as a fully remote team and the COVID-19 situation is that choice. So we have recruited a team where people are aware in terms of that working situation, that this is what they're coming into. Some of those people are working from home, some are working from other offices, but they know they are not working alongside their kind of day-to-day teammates that they are working with. Now that hasn't been something that the, Tanya, I think if we could just flip back the slides. I think it's gone. Yeah, there we go. So that is a choice that no one has been able to make over the last few months, and it's been entirely removed, and that needs a lot of sort of careful consideration, as you will all be very aware, in terms of managing the incredibly different situations for different team members. So working in a full home office, you know, as I do, because I've always worked from home, versus working from your bed, as some team members were forced to do because they didn't have that kind of setup, is very different. It has very different, you know, implications for your mental and your physical health, which both of which again have been compounded by COVID-19. So, and the other thing I think that I have, and this is from a very personal sort of reflection, experienced, is by working remotely at sort of different stages of my career so far, there are hugely different impacts in terms of people's life stages. So, you know, for me personally, when I sort of think to my early 20s, I moved to a big job in a big new city, and work really was my social life. And that was a huge element. Fast forward to having a family, and on a personal level, huge benefits to being able to make parents' evening and other things like that from not having the commute. Obvious caveat being the lack of sort of school and childcare during lockdown, but really thinking through what those sort of different implications are as a sort of a manager or leader of a team, and how you can help to manage those, the kind of the practical elements of the home office space versus the kind of the mental and physical health elements as well. Briefly back to Tanya now on the sort of working from anywhere, working from home piece.
Thanks, Kat. So I think we've observed as a team this very interesting and false dichotomy that's in the conversation of, you know, are people working from home? And it also relates a little bit to the UN, our context, being a fairly traditional kind of working style, and you know, being very much from the bureaucratic approach of I see people, they're in front of their computers, they're at meetings, therefore I see them work, they must be working, to being sort of slightly more comfortable with the idea that they are not in the office, but they are working from this place that I can put my finger on, which is home. But in actual fact, that's a completely sort of false piece. It's a false kind of dichotomy, because by sort of framing this kind of work from home, it's actually fairly limiting. And what we're really we should be much more interested in is not where the person is, but what they're actually doing, and whether the environment that they're in is conducive to them being, you know, incredibly productive. And of course, for all of us, it's even slightly less about productivity, and it's much more around the kind of creativity that people are bringing, that entrepreneurial thinking, the kind of where are they getting their inspiration from, who are they being able to connect with in ecosystems other than, in addition to, the ones that all of us have through, albeit even our remote kind of teams. And so we really think about work from anywhere, because it doesn't matter if it's a coffee shop or it is, you know, your sofa. What really matters is whether that context is the one that is most conducive to getting done what needs to be done at that moment. So I think it's quite interesting to think about the office. Is the office dead? And I think we do feel that the office as we knew it is not going to return. But having said that, I think we're looking at very different models, which are very much, as Helen introduced this session, to be that hybrid model. So we sort of see there is a start to the return to office in various, you know, locations. Of course, that depends which duty station you're in. But, you know, it's definitely looking, as we kind of look at plans around the world, not that everyone is coming back. Not that the sort of spaces are going to be used in the way that they were before. And that really has a number of interesting drivers behind it. One of them is that this change has forced equally upon team members, but also managers, to experience and understand where they may have had doubts about whether people working remotely can work. Many people have been quite surprised to discover that not only can it, it does. It's also obviously unlocked other opportunities for people thinking about relocating work. So either relocating it partially, X numbers, you know, X days a week of people not necessarily needing to be in the office, to entirely dislocating work from wherever it may physically be right now, in any one of our kind of UN locations, to other locations, lower cost locations, etc. So we're definitely seeing many ideas of what these hybrid teams are about. But there are some fundamental things about how to manage and cultivate and nurture high performance, high impact teams, regardless of where they're located. The other reflection that we've been talking about as a team has been around what is the future of cities? And all of us, and I've sort of looked at where everyone introduced themselves in the chat, are largely, you know, located in cities, whether it was Geneva or Kuala Lumpur or Bogota. Those are all, you know, major cities, but really, what is the future of those? And we're sort of, is kind of, I suppose, from our futurist hat, really thinking about not only is it unknown, but there is a whole potential for resurgence of really smaller second or, you know, second level cities, and even smaller kinds of towns, because once you no longer need to have people gathered in these kind of major and often high cost locations, and have proved to yourself through this horrible experiment that we've all been a part of, that it opens up a lot of options. So I think what we definitely see is the future is that not only within the UN, but certainly maybe the UN is a little behind other organizations in other sectors, that massive changes in what work means and where it happens are well underway. Kat, maybe you'd love to share a little example here about a high-performing team.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think also just building on that very last point about sort of what we are hearing from some other kind of organizations and industries. So I'm thinking some tech startups where they are sort of getting rid of the kind of idea of office space that they're coming into, but they are still expecting that maybe one day a week they'll have a, you know, and this is kind of in post-COVID times where you can have people together in one space, but there would be perhaps a day a week where everyone comes into a shared space. And that's the kind of some of the hybrids that some other kind of industries are potentially looking at. And then you also have this kind of piece of how much of it is, you know, some people might work well and be motivated kind of working on their own. Others might need people around them, whether that's their direct team or whether that's about them having a space in a co-working space, and tapping into other kind of social ecosystems. Again, sort of very interesting kind of questions arise which link into that kind of future of towns versus cities. You know, is it the right time to invest in kind of co-working spaces in small towns, for example, right now? But just moving on to this kind of example of the Generation Unlimited Use Challenge. So this was a global kind of program that we designed and delivered at pace with an entirely virtual team. So currently in its sort of second round and iteration, with a sort of a number of other partners actually joining us. I don't know whether any of them are on the call today, from UNDP in particular, but we were working, so as a team, we were working from 5 different countries, working closely with sort of 16 country offices, regional offices, HQ, to design, sort of build, testing and learning at pace. And the team that you can hopefully see in the bottom right hand corner, so this is the first time that we actually sort of met in the flesh, minus our designer from Uzbekistan, and that was 15 months, that was December 2019, and that was actually, I said 15 months, probably more like 18 months actually, after we started working together on this sort of project. So really kind of showing that you can deliver quite significant time-bound things across countries with an entirely virtual team. But there were quite a lot of things that we learned from that. The very obvious one is you're blessed if you're on a European or African time zone, I think. Much, much harder, as Tanya said earlier, for colleagues in sort of East Asia particularly, and for the sort of further west in the Americas. So you have to kind of come up with some boundaries, I think, and whether that is Friday nights is sacrosanct in East Asia, or whether it is, I mean, my one was about turning off my email notifications on my phone, because literally 24/7 kind of emails, including from MENA countries on a Sunday, and having that kind of intrusion, I suppose, at any time of the day and night was just too much. So I think that kind of, you have to find out your own kind of boundaries that work, and you have to make sure, I think, within your team that people are doing that, because otherwise there is literally no sort of off time. I think it takes time to build the sort of mechanisms that you use to work together, and particularly to challenge each other. And I think if you're building something new, as all of us are in the kind of innovation networks, the challenge piece is really important. So it's something you kind of need to think about in terms of how you're creating that sort of safe space virtually, so that you can kind of actively challenge each other. Some of the things that we didn't do, with hindsight, I think now in this sort of COVID time, is we missed the virtual celebration. So that kind of moment of launch, the moment when we announced the sort of winning youth teams, felt a bit flat, actually, just to kind of see that sort of on Twitter or something happening. You miss the kind of adrenaline that I think you get from delivering something when you're all together in the office. And I think what I would have learned now from seeing some quite creative ways of doing, whether it's a virtual leaving do or other things like that, is that we should have come together for those experiences. And even if we were across different time zones, so someone might have had a beer, someone else might have had a coffee, but just to actually sort of toast those moments and recognize them together. And I think the other thing, which is again very relevant as we move more towards hybrid teams, is that we are social creatures, and that kind of human interaction is important. So the kind of the December meeting was really valuable for actually forging additional sort of real personal connections. And I think that as we sort of move into probably what will be a more hybrid world, thinking about how to build those personal connections will be really important. Now, depending on where people are physically based, that could be a personal connection that happens once a week, once a month, once a year, if you're lucky in a globally remote team. But I think also, particularly perhaps within our sort of UN network, thinking about how you design those. So I think everyone will have had an experience of coming together for sort of some kind of conferencey, workshopy type event, where actually the most valuable pieces have been the networking you do in the coffee breaks and the lunch breaks after that. So thinking about how we flip those experiences so that the kind of networking experiences are the reasons for coming together. And we make those really rich, and we design them in a way to sort of enable those encounters that will enable you to just kind of pick up the phone, the Zoom, the whatever, to someone in a different time zone, you know, after that experience, I think will be really key. And hopefully we will kind of see the death of those really long kind of panel presentations that you realize no one is listening to, but everyone has sort of flown from all around the world to listen to. So I will now hand back over to Tanya as we move on to the next slide.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on that point, Kat. You know, the December meeting, which is the one you can kind of see of the core 4 team on the bottom right, and the photos that I shared on our sort of second slide. You know, I think as organizations, we're a bit sort of schizophrenic, because as Kat said, we'll invest a lot of money, or we had in the past, of flying people to many places, so to global meetings or regional network meetings, where, you know, we didn't really in the past think very intentionally about how we make the most of that investment. But at the same time, you know, making the investment of bringing together sort of fully remote teams, or teams, for example, if you're in a hybrid team where there are members who are not in one location where many others are, sometimes it's kind of short-sighted, but when it gets to sort of talking about travel budgets, and of course, who knows what those will look like truly in the future, but we would absolutely say make the strongest case you can for bringing together those remote members of your hybrid team, or indeed a fully remote team together, because while those individual members, those hybrid teams, those fully remote teams can be incredibly productive, you know, empowered, etc., there is just something that is both, there's tangible and intangible benefits about actually making the investment, of which there will be returns, in actually bringing those people together. And we're sort of, both Kat and I are reading your comments and questions and concerns in the chat. And I think a number of them we'll be talking about in this next slide, but there's some of them that are truly intriguing, and I think would be really great to talk about further in the kind of discussion portion. So I'm just looking at Linda's comment about how you know, how these kinds of different jobs, those that can lend themselves to being fully remote versus those, or to telecommuting, and those that can't, could end up creating kind of another class of staff and consultants. And really, what does that mean? Because that means it's another force for sort of disunity within a team potentially. So I think that's really really interesting observation. So we thought that it would be helpful as we reflected on what we've learned, what we would share, and what we wish we had done, to kind of look at kind of 4 main categories of things that you can sort of see how to sort of lead, how to manage, the whole piece around esprit de corps, and communication, which for us are the 4 kind of major pillars of managing remotely in an effective way. And also to consider the sort of different generic roles that people could find themselves in. So I'll kick this off and talk about what we've learned around how to lead. And, you know, throughout and across every member in a team, regardless if they're actually in an executive position or, you know, any other position on a team, none of this will work if there is insufficient trust. Because this ranges from, do I trust that people are going to have good judgment? Do I trust my team managers to be able to coordinate their work? Do I trust individual people to be independent and be able to, you know, to be self-organizing? And if there is a deficit of trust, that has to kind of be one of the major areas of focus in an organization, in a team, because many of the other things won't actually work, because they are sort of disposed in considering that there is sufficient trust capital. And some of these ideas that we're kind of go through here, some of our lessons learned, are also about how to build on that. But there certainly needs to be a foundation. Another component around leading a team, especially when, you know, you're not seeing each other, or you're not seeing each other as regularly as you may have, is that we really need to be clear on kind of what the vision, mission, and mandate is. So more than ever, people do need to understand individually, as individual team members, what part of this bigger vision and mission are they contributing to? How are they making a difference? What is the bigger picture? Because you could also have, and we've sort of experienced all of these things where people are very busy, they have a lot of activities, but if it's really not clear, you know, what that bigger vision is, it's very difficult to keep sort of high levels of motivation going. And also it has a direct kind of impact on your team and individual morale and you know, just general energy. So I think that spending time on unpacking that, on making sure that there's coherence and clear understanding of what are we here to do, why is this valuable, and you're kind of going to be also building up your trust both ways in people being able to make independent decisions, large and small. As long as you're kind of aligned, those decisions will come out, you know, to be really great ones. But the more that there is kind of a lack of coherence or there's confusion, this can kind of lead to a lot of miscommunication. We're asked to also talk a little bit about kind of culture change across the organization. And I think very early on, one of the things that we contributed into our kind of executive level discussion was, you know, there's an opinion about never letting a crisis go to waste. And certainly we can sort of see that there's different ways of injecting culture change into an organization. The COVID crisis has been about injecting an unchosen change, which has meant that people have been forced, whether they're team members or managers, to adopt to a completely new way of working. But that also has introduced other opportunities to, for example, I know you had earlier sessions on different sorts of tools that can support remote working. So a lot of the introduction en masse of these sorts of different tools and platforms, etc., has been that much easier because you have a larger dislocation happening. But obviously, we'd all hope that culture change would be a much more sort of positive, you know, would have much more positive genesis to it. There's sort of these 3 points here around managing up, recognition, and career development. I know, Caro, you mentioned that this was, especially the kind of career development component, was a real concern, and we have found that as well. And this, I think, is the manager role is absolutely key, because while in one sense, this sort of remote or virtualized workspace does mean you can act potentially as a much flatter organization, it is easier to kind of reach out to other people that you might have, you know, felt there were more barriers to walking into their office or having to speak to their secretary, etc. If that's the sort of setup in your organization. The manager becomes key because he or she absolutely has additional responsibility to doing a number of things. One, obviously within the team, making sure that people's you know, milestones are celebrated, recognized, and most importantly, visible. So there's a massive component around not only managing up if you're a team member to your manager, if you're a manager to the executive or leadership level, but in actually taking an almost promotional role, you know, really taking seriously that career development, career positioning role of all the people on your team, because it is very easy to be completely invisible, except for the most kind of you know, significant initiatives that get delivered. And there is a real reason why, as Caro said, you know, people are very anxious about this, because we have come from a culture where, you know, seeing is believing or seeing is validation. And so a lot more time and intentionality needs to be you know, spent on that. And we have also, as a result, thought a little bit more thoughtfully around how we communicate internally and use a whole range of those platforms, you know, to do so more effectively. Then just sort of in terms of team members in the leadership piece, we've also found it's really important that within, you know, everyone's activities and work, that there is a project or initiative that they really care about. That is sort of something that can be the sort of their passion project. because there's obviously some of the work that might have had some ancillary benefit because you're in the office interacting with people, it doesn't exist. And so it's sort of, what is it that's going to keep those, keep the enthusiasm, the ideas, the energy bubbling. And it's trying to find within, you know, what we all have to do in our own kind of mandates, that thing for each person that is really sort of inspiring and rewarding. And then just in terms of the how to manage piece, there's some really specific things for managers that are kind of key, and that one of them is really recognizing the distinction between independence and interdependence. So one of the challenges for any manager where you have a team that isn't sort of physically together, isn't communicating the same way that it did before, or in fact is rarely going to get together, is ensuring that you have a good balance between people being empowered to be independent, to exercise their judgment, to manage their work, but also recognizing that this team, whatever team it is not made up of, you know, a dozen lone wolves, but it actually is still a team. And I know a number of you commented about, you know, how do you engender that? And Kat will talk a bit more about that in a minute. But it's really walking that balance between that independence of each person, but also emphasizing the interdependence of that work. And one of the kinds of tools that can be quite useful, even at a conceptual level, is this sort of this RACI model, which is around what are you responsible for, accountable for, who should you be communicating with, who do you just need to inform, and really kind of being very, very specific about how as a team you sort of are delivering results. I know for years and years across the UN, we've all been talking about results-based management, but if there's actually a time that will emphasize that as a real intentional results-based piece, this is it. Because as these kind of next couple of bullets point to, if we're not clear about priorities, if we do not understand as both the team member and the manager, what is required, what level of effort is required, what sort of resources, time, whose input is required to deliver something, this is going to sort of end up in a not sort of good space. And that is really why we sort of said here in a team member, one of the things that we look for and look to cultivate are these kind of consulting type skills. So people who understand how to accurately estimate how much time and effort, people who can learn and whose project management skills can be strengthened or who already have those. And, you know, all of that wraps up to quite a huge set of roadblocks, if you will, that need to be navigated by someone who's new. Because that person, especially if they're new to the organization, let alone, let's even say new to the United Nations kind of system, has a massive challenge. So they have to adapt to the culture without being able to pick it up from being around others. They have no network, and they don't even know who to sort of reach out to or who's who in the network. The expectations run the risk of not being clear, even if you have a really clear way of operating. If that new person, if you don't spend and invest really a serious amount of time on not just a few weeks, but literally a few months, that is going to seem like a closed book to that new person. And so really one of the ways I think is around not only your manager in a coaching sort of relationship, but also your peers as coaches, because really the success of the new joiner in being able to adapt, adopt, and really become a valuable member and a person who feels a genuine part of the team, that isn't going to happen without an investment in them, especially in kind of a hybrid or fully remote team. Kat, turning it over to you for the next two pillars.
Thank you. Thanks, Tanya. So I think the sort of talking a bit about how you have that team spirit and communication. And I think the first sort of one of the key pieces on team spirit goes back to one of the first points Tanya made around kind of empowerment. I think the sort of motivation, you have to have a degree of self-motivation that perhaps some people might feel more comfortable with than others. So thinking about how you can support and facilitate that through being very clear in terms of objectives, thinking about kind of passion projects, and also just recognizing, like, sort of, you know, as an individual or as a sort of a manager or a leader, recognizing that people's motivations will come in different ways, and expecting people to sit in front of Zoom from sort of 9 till 5 is very unlikely to be the way that people are going to be motivated to work best. So recognizing what the pieces are, how, depending on within your team, that can be managed, I think, and coming to kind of consensus across the team around what those expectations are in terms of, okay, there's X meetings per week or X time per day where you're expected to be available either on scheduled calls or at short notice. But then, beyond that, it's like, some people are night owls. Luckily, we have one of our team who's in Seoul who is luckily a night owl. Some people are early birds. And I think, let people work at the times where possible, let people work at the times where they will work best, because that is a key piece in terms of, I think, having the motivation to do it. And I think it's perhaps more obvious, as sort of an off day is perhaps more obvious when you're sitting at home, versus an off day for people in the office might be one where they've just not quite got going. They've sort of had, a number of coffees, talked to quite a few people, and that happens in the office, but it probably is slightly masked in a way that when you're at home, it probably feels a lot more than that. And sometimes just downing tools for half an hour, doing something else, and then getting back to it is kind of what you need. So I think that kind of managing your own and your team's expectations around that is really key, and is a learning journey. I think video, the big change I found as someone who'd worked before, a few big changes, but having worked remotely before and during COVID, is a lot more people have put video on. And that's actually been really, really good, I would say, in terms of kind of thinking, being able to connect with people a bit more than you are from just the kind of voice. Another big difference has been, there were some large kind of team meetings that I used to dial into at sort of HQ as the only one of maybe one or two people who were remote. And quite frankly, they were awful experiences, because you were the only voice, you couldn't gauge when to jump in. So designing, and I think it goes back to some of the comments I saw about the kind of designing for virtual or designing for kind of hybrid teams. We're all innovation people. We all have some experience of kind of, to different degrees, of sort of human-centered design, user-centered design. We do have to strip some of this back and actually think, what does it look like? Because what we do know is, if you just try and take the same processes from a kind of a physical into a digital world, you won't be doing it as effectively. So thinking about that design process, I think, is really key. The avoiding work, sort of overwork and burnout, something I touched on earlier. You have to be really careful on this, I think, particularly in organisations like ours that are genuinely around the globe, and the expectations can just become absolutely kind of unmanageable. So I think helping people to find what their sort of coping mechanisms are for that. The flip side is that it can be fantastic being on different time zones. So the fact that you can pass things around the world in an asynchronous manner, if you get it going around the right way in terms of time zones, can be brilliant. I was going to ask Tanya to sort of use a specific example, but I can see we're quite short on time, so we shall pass on that for the moment. Virtual social activities has been an interesting one. And I think, I mean, I don't know how many of you know, so I'm British, the food Marmite. It's the sort of love it or hate it tagline. And I think that's definitely some of the feedback we've had about sort of virtual social activities. So some of them have been absolutely brilliant and some people love them. And it's the absolute glue that keeps people together. Other people say, look, I just can't stand doing it, quite frankly. It makes me cringe. So again, I think it's something we have brought in a lot more since COVID. And I think in general, they've been great. So, kind of Kahoot quizzes for leaving dues. People have done virtual tours. There have been kind of cooking sessions, all sorts of different things. But I think probably make those optional rather than mandatory. And actually something that we're about to start trying is more kind of, how are we sharing? So one of the things you miss is sometimes just looking over someone's shoulder and saying, oh, what's that you're using? That looks like an interesting tool. So how can we kind of probably intersperse some of the more sort of social things with some of just the kind of sharing, I've read this, it's really interesting, can we have a chat about it? And those kind of team interactions to just kind of build some of that kind of team glue. And I think the social challenge sort of for new joiners is huge. And I think there are some interesting pieces. I've read some interesting work from Accenture, for example, on how they've designed a virtual internship program. And I think it's worth, there are some good pieces of writing and things out there which are worth looking at if you are specifically looking at kind of a new cohort coming in. In terms of sort of communications, I think there's, you know, one of the challenges we have we are coming across, and I wouldn't say we have in any way solved, but I think it's an issue that we have and are sort of alive to, is that people are remote. They're not getting necessarily just kind of the small bits of information they might get in very uncertain times. Sort of some people are sort of also keen to have a lot of structure in terms of those things, others much less so. So trying to get that balance of kind of sharing the bigger picture information coming down, but also recognizing that stuff is changing so much. And you kind of just being, I guess, keeping tapped into what you're hearing from team members around that. On the sort of channels, I know there have been a number of webinars already on channels. I think the thing is, one of the key things we've found is trying to differentiate between social and work channels. So we do have WhatsApp. We were using it a lot for work, but actually on the feedback from a number of people, we're trying to use that more for some social bits. And then if it's a work related thing, that sticks on Teams, which is, you know, a work channel. So trying to make sure, again, that we're not kind of putting work, I suppose, if someone's on holiday, they probably don't want all of the work stuff coming through on WhatsApp. So that kind of thing, again, for remote sort of meetings, having, you know, you have to be prepared sometimes to go from Zoom to Skype to all of these things. So having them there as a backup. And I think one of the things we've touched on a lot is this kind of how you can get the balance between the formal and informal. So a lot of people are saying, well, I'm in meetings like 8 hours a day. It's sort of impossible. Really trying to think about whether things have to be done on meeting. Is it something that could be done on a shared document instead? Could you share information in advance so you're just meeting to have a discussion about things, and making sure that that's kind of, you know, you're not wasting people's time in meetings. But then the flip side of that is trying to carve out some time for the more informal pieces. So how about reaching out and having a virtual coffee with someone without having a specific agenda? How can you kind of have, if you've got a challenge you're facing, can you kind of have 2 of your teammates there to sort of bounce ideas with? How do we get that sort of collaboration happening? Some of which might be things you need to do within the team, but also are there other networks that you can tap into that can give you some of that kind of intellectual challenge, intellectual kind of stimulation, particularly within the innovation space. I think we all sort of have that need to kind of bounce ideas off each other. So I'm aware we are kind of coming quite close to time, so I shall wrap there and hand over to, I don't know if it's Helen or to Tanya.
Yeah, my closing thought was this, before handing to Helen, which is, you know, we're all on this call, we're in innovation teams where there is more space to do something different. It's almost kind of part of the default expectation. So I think, you know, trying to grab some of that space to do things differently, and to kind of make use of that innovation terminology would be a great, you know, way to contribute to proving something, right? You're piloting, you're proving, you're building evidence that something works for the rest of the organization. We're going to shift this back to Helen. We've got, so to moderate the questions.
Yeah, so I've just posted in the chat, we've got about 7 minutes, so I think we should be able to get through just a few questions. I know we've had some really great comments coming through so far. But does anyone have any burning questions to ask before we go? I think there was a good, this is sort of more of a comment from Fernando about the kind of rush to be seen working. Do you have any insights about how you might sort of push back against that and avoid that kind of, you know, rush to be seen?
Yes, I think so. I think absolutely. I think that this is a very, very on point observation, and that was really around kind of how to manage visibility. And I think a lot of us spend time thinking around how to manage that visibility externally in terms of external communication. If you're needing to sustain a, that is going to be partially virtual, even when others are maybe rushing back to be in a physical location, I think we need to spend significantly more time than we have in the past in understanding the visibility for the initiatives and the individuals, so that it trumps showing up, basically, because showing up is just being in the room, but really, is the room there anymore? So I think if we can still use, there are a couple of months ahead where you can actually position this, where are the places that people kind of hang out? What are the kind of distribution networks that you can kind of, position your pieces of communication that are around, hey, this is what this team is delivering, or kudos to a specific person. I think Kara also made a point here that managers are absolutely having to dedicate a lot more time to intentional, thoughtful, structured communication, more one-on-ones, more bilaterals, and I think it's more of short-term meetings though, because certainly, what we do experience in other parts of our organization is it's like the normal work day, just with little squares, and it is not the most productive or effective way of working.
Thanks for that, Tanya. We had another question, which I think is maybe a little bit more around the kind of having meetings with a virtual team, asking about what to do when people are dominating airtime, and how to maybe deal with meetings that are structured a little bit differently, because they do need to be a bit shorter to keep people's attention span. How do you keep things on track and keep people from dominating the meeting?
Ah, yes. Well, I think we can recognize those people from when they were physically in the room too, So I think one is, setting kind of the ground rules, right? At the beginning, just as you would say, facilitating a physical workshop or something. And then there are other, kinds of the more gentle to less gentle, thanking a person, asking for, putting, to allow other people to speak. And then of course, if you're the admin, you can literally make their unmute button become not functional. So if you really do have someone who's truly, disrupting things. But I think the point there though, Helen, was also that when we're sort of gathering together, having a structure, a clear purpose, and what does success look like for this gathering or this meeting, and when we reach it, that's when we stop. Because I think the other thing that we've noticed is, people have a tendency to schedule things for an hour, and they get to 40 minutes, 50, whatever it is, and the job is done, but they feel obligated to somehow suck up the rest of the time, which is quite bizarre. Over.
And I would just add a couple of other sort of practical pieces in terms of that sort of management is around using the chat, I think, and sort of, so whoever is facilitating that, so you're kind of getting people to put a bit in the chat, and then you can choose who you go to. I know we've talked about sort of tools in other workshops, but finding things like Miro and kind of the virtual whiteboards can be good in terms of then everyone can work on those documents collaboratively. We did similar things in Google Docs before we had a Miro account, and it just means like everyone's got a pen. So again, you can then specifically ask people to kind of explain their contribution, and actually just the timer. So the Miro, sort of having that timer up, when one of the worst things is people sort of type, if you say, could you present for 3 minutes, or could you present for 5 minutes on this, it's the sort of 25 minutes later, and that timer is a really powerful tool to use at times.
It's a great point.
Absolutely.
And I guess in some ways having that built into some of your online meetings makes it even easier. It's sort of, you may not be able to set a timer in a live meeting room, but you can do it online. It doesn't feel too strange. I know someone Caro asked about Miro. I don't know if you want to explain a bit. We can also share that in a follow-up as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, we've been looking at, different kinds of virtual collaboration and sort of, if you will, like sort of turning that human-centered design techniques of where you'd be in a room with Post-it notes, where it's just kind of in a virtual endless space. We've been looking at kind of Mural and Miro and other tools, but for us, because we're dealing with different types of connectivity to different offices in 193 places, that is the most kind of stable one. And I know, Helen, you could definitely share a link to that particular tool. I know we're just about at time, so I wanted to share one tip for anyone who gets themselves stuck in a time zone that is vastly different. So I know, like Susan, you're in Kuala Lumpur. I used to be in Bangkok, and where, the heartbeat of the organization is in New York. When people keep inviting you to meetings that are your Friday night, what you should do, it works every time, is to say, I can't make it Friday night, but I can make my Saturday morning. And sometimes that doesn't generally hit home. And everyone is like, oh, well, Saturday morning. But when they realize that's your Friday night, I think that's kind of a great illustration. And of course, I can guarantee no one will accept that invitation. It haven't yet for me over the 5 years that I was in Bangkok. But I think that's just an illustration of trying to use something pretty concrete to swivel people to have empathy. And I think that's the key piece. Where we have empathy, we can build, relationships, better communication, and, trust. And I know a lot of these comments are really around kind of trust and culture change and time. And I think that's the other piece is some of this culture change will take a huge amount of time, because our organizations have worked this way since, pretty much the day they were founded. So it is a pandemic sort of range change that has happened. So thank you, Helen. I think we're from Kat and I, and especially to everyone who joined today. It's a real pleasure for the chance to sort of share our experiences. And we look forward to now being able to call on any one of you for that virtual coffee.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tanya and Kat. That was fantastic. And thank you for everyone who's joined us, and for all of you who've been here throughout the boot camp. I hope you've learned a lot. I know I've had some really useful insights today, and from the rest of our session. So thank you. Feel free to, if you want to turn on the gallery view one more time and give everyone a wave, one final, video on moment, just for a second to say goodbye. It's great to see your faces. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evenings, wherever you are in the world.